Scuffles at Australia's University of Queensland in July when pro-Beijing demonstrators disrupted a rally in support of the Hong Kong protests. Video posted on social media showed the two sides hurling abuse at each other while the Chinese national anthem blasted from a speaker. It was not an isolated incident on a campus where about 17% of students come from China. Protesters critical of Beijing's policies are frequently confronted by Chinese Communist Party loyalists. It's a situation echoed in other international universities with large Chinese student bodies. At the University of Auckland in New Zealand, a video posted on YouTube showed a heated exchange between pro-Hong Kong demonstrators and supporters of China.
Hong Kong is different from China.
Hong Kong is a part of China. If you don't like China, get out of China, okay? Hong Kong is a part of China. Okay, Hong Kong is part of China. I tell you that.
A Lenin wall at the college and others around the world have been vandalised multiple times. The walls, made up of messages of support, have been a key feature of the Hong Kong protests. At Simon Fraser University in Canada, a man was filmed ripping down the notes. It's tactics like these that have raised concerns because they could threaten freedom of speech on campus. Protesters also say they have been intimidated and threatened after taking part in student rallies against China, with much of the abuse happening on Chinese social media platforms like WeChat or Weibo.
Adila Yar Mohammed is a student at the University of Adelaide in Australia and has been at a number of these demonstrations where pro- and anti-China students have faced off against each other. I began by asking her how these interactions have generally been.
At some of the protests, it is quite civil. At the others, they do get a bit heated. So on one side, you'll have the pro-Hong Kongers chanting or having a couple of speeches, and on the other side, you have the pro-Chinese protesters singing the Chinese national anthem, also chanting slogans. At a lot of these protests, they are open mic, and we do allow the pro-Chinese students to come and speak if they want to. When those who do speak are quite civilized, they do try to, they're quite civilized, and they try to ask what our experiences are, but they're also quite closed-minded, and they don't want to understand. Although they ask to understand, they also don't want to. So they do get a bit confusing to seeing them in perspective of the pro-Chinese students.
There have been allegations and there have been reports in the media that perhaps there is some state backing for a lot of the pro-China students. Do you agree with that? Do you find that? Do you think that, do you see on campus that potentially there could be some backing from certain quarters for these pro-China students?
I do believe that there may be some sort of financial backing or support from the Chinese government towards these students. However, I haven't seen it firsthand in regards to the students here in Adelaide. I do believe we had the student politics elections a couple of weeks ago, and we had a group called International Voice, which was majority Chinese students, international Chinese students. There were reports afterwards that those students were telling other Chinese students that if they didn't support them, if they didn't vote for them, that they would eventually be deported back to China. So there were these kind of threats that may be linked towards the government system, but they're not quite proven. There have been other instances with other protests in the last couple of years where Chinese communities, Chinese families, and Chinese international students have come out supporting perhaps a Chinese official member coming to Australia, where we're protesting against his arrival,
right.
Who have been supported by the Chinese consulate.
Student Adila Yar Mohammed there. Let's bring in Alex Yoski from the Australian capital, Canberra. Now, Alex is an analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and he has done a lot of research on alleged Chinese interference in Australia. Alex, good to have you on the program. Can I just ask you at the outset, does it look like the Chinese state is orchestrating or supporting students who are protesting on Australian university campuses?
Thank you. At the very least, we know that the Chinese government is encouraging these kinds of activities. The consulate has released statements encouraging students to show their patriotism and protect China's sovereignty. And there's a lot of evidence that groups linked to the Chinese government are involved in orchestrating some of these protests.
The Australian government has set up a task force to look at Chinese interference in Australian university campuses. How is that task force going to proceed? What are the things they're going to be looking at?
Well, they're going to be looking at a whole range of areas, including cyber, research collaboration, freedom of speech, and some of these issues around what the Chinese Communist Party is trying to do to influence students and discussions on university campuses. So it'll be a forum that brings together the Australian government with university officials, hopefully to deal with these issues.
But Alex, why is it so easy for the Chinese embassy or for the Chinese government to be able to encourage and support these protests on Australian university campuses? Surely there must be something that the Australian government can do.
Well, for a long time, the Australian government and universities have really turned a blind eye to a lot of the work that the Chinese government does on our university campuses to build influence networks and to be able to mobilize Chinese students. And in fact, there are very few levers that the government currently has to deal with this issue. There's simply such a large number of organizations linked to the Chinese government operating on our campuses to influence politics, influence discussions, and protect the interests of the Chinese Communist Party.
So how effective will this task force really be that the government has appointed?
I think it'll be effective in getting the universities themselves to do more, because ultimately the real burden should be on our universities to do more to integrate Chinese students, to protect them from surveillance and intimidation by the Chinese Communist Party. And it's only by getting universities on board that I think the government can deal with these issues.
The alternate argument, of course, here would be that Chinese students, or if you call them pro-Beijing students, they have an equal right to protest and to voice their opinions on Australian universities, and that should not be seen as interference. Would that be fair to say?
I think that is very fair. I think in Australia, as a free and democratic society, we do tolerate voices from all kinds of perspectives. But the difference and part of the concern here is that the Chinese government does seem to be having a role in some of these activities. So rather than being genuine expressions of political or patriotic sentiments, these are activities facilitated by the Chinese government and also facilitated by the propaganda bubble that it has grown overseas through platforms like the social media app WeChat.
Alex Yazzie from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, thank you very much for that.
Thank you.